Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Book Number 5, Atlantis Station, Chapter 9. "We're trapped," Lissa's voice shook. "I don't want to die here." Tavarian stared at her with blank incomprehension. "Hysteria is not logical. Your rebreather will provide sufficient oxygen until the rescue teams arrive." Despite her level tone, Tavarian was shaking. Geordi thought she was almost as upset as Lissa. At least with Tavarian, Geordi could understand her reaction. Being surrounded by this much water must be affecting her. He can imagine her explanation. Having so much water in one place is not logical. Well, logical or not, they had to get through the flooded section. Waiting for the rescue team sounded less appealing by the minute. "Leilani," he asked, "is there any way around this section?" She shook her head. "Not without going clear around the station's rim. Usually, we could go through the central core, but it's sealed off. That's why the computer is down and the main power is off." "You can't be sure of that." Todd glared at Leilani. "You haven't checked." "No, I haven't." Leilani shoved her hair away from her face. "But I know this station. It was built to take a lot of punishment, and the only time the computer links should disconnect is if the central core floods." "You still don't know," Todd insisted. "I vote we go through the central core." Geordi thought about how long that would take. The earthquakes had shaken the station badly, and he didn't know how long they had before the structure failed. If one section was leaking, others probably were too. Leilani tapped her communicator. "Can anyone hear me? We're in Sector SR5A. Is anyone within communicator range?" There was no answer. Leilani tried again with no better results. Either everyone made it to their escape pods or... She shrugged, leaving them to finish her thought. "We're the only people left alive in the station." Prying the cover off the control panel, Geordi examined the exposed circuits. He whistled. "Boy, is this ever an antique!" He remembered using such a board for a school science project. His fingers groped for the emergency battery. "I can get the door open," he said, "but all that water will pour through here at once. We'll have to hang to each other, or it'll wash us away." "It's too dangerous." Todd started back the way they had come. After 4 steps, he turned to see who was following him. Amaral and Amaray exchanged worried looks, glanced at Ven, and then looked at each other again. The Andorian was only partially aware of his surroundings. "We believe the shortest route," Amaray began, "is the one we should take." Amaral finished the sentence. "All roads are equal to true samurai," Yoshi said. Geordi wasn't sure what he meant, but he didn't follow Todd. Lissa started toward Todd, then paused. No one else was going with her. She glanced from Todd to the others. "It is not logical to assume that this is the only section that is flooded," Tavarian said in a small voice. "The earthquakes have been much more severe than the station was designed to withstand." "That's it, then," Leilani said. "Geordi, what do you need us to do?" Geordi looked at the telltales again. The pressure door was a pair of doors connected by a flexible tube. The tube let different sections of the station shift position relative to each other. This helped the structure weather severe earthquakes without breaking apart. The gauge told Geordi only that there was water on the other side of this door. If the tube had ruptured, opening the door would flood this section without getting them into the next one. He crossed his fingers and popped the battery out of its socket. "The control unit is offline," he said. "We should be able to pull the door open now." Leilani guided the Stenarios girls and Ven into the corner. "You two keep Ven back against the wall. Geordi, Yoshi, and Todd will pull open the door, while the rest of us make sure they don't get washed away. Everyone, put on your rebreathers." They opened their cases. Geordi fitted the lightweight plastic mask over his nose and mouth. When he pushed the seals against his face, the air purifying unit on his waist started working. He checked the hose that went from the mask to the rebreather unit, making sure nothing leaked. Finally, he examined the gauges to see that everything was working properly. The readouts were fine, but the model number was wrong. He rechecked it, fighting a cold feeling in his stomach. This style of rebreather was a light-duty unit, designed for use in shallow water. It had power for at most 6 hours of operation. They had that long to get back to their shuttle. Should he mention the problem? Geordi wondered. After a moment, he decided to keep quiet. He should have plenty of time before his batteries ran out, and the group didn't need any more problems. The other cadets were in their assigned places before Todd put on his mask. Reluctantly, he joined Geordi and Yoshi. The three boys worked their fingers into the narrow gap and pulled. Nothing happened. They tried again with no better luck. They changed positions before the third time. With some careful maneuvering, each found a spot to brace a foot against the doorframe. They pulled, but still nothing happened. "Are you sure you took the battery out?" Todd snarled. "Or did you lock it so we're stuck here forever?" "I don't know. I'll look again." Geordi popped the control panel out of its clips and turned it over. As he had thought, he'd removed the battery. So why was the door still locked? He studied the circuit labels more carefully. The panel wasn't as familiar as he'd originally thought. One section was completely different, and several optical fibers linked those circuits to something deeper in the wall. More backup systems? He wondered. There was one way to find out. Geordi took the piece of sharp plastic from his waist bag. With one stroke, he cut the fibers. "That's the best I can do," he said. Todd scowled but braced himself in the doorway. Geordi and Yoshi returned to their places. Once more they pulled. The door came open easily. Geordi stumbled backward, falling into Tavarian. She pushed him into the corner, then stopped, staring. A wall of water poured through the door. Geordi grabbed her and pulled her against Ven and the clones. Yoshi and Lissa crowded against Tavarian, but Leilani was having trouble. Todd had been too far into the hallway and the water had caught him. Leilani wasn't strong enough to pull him back. Her feet were sliding on the wet floor. Soon she would lose her footing and both she and Todd would be swept away. What could he hold on to? Geordi looked around frantically. The only possibility was the opening where the control panel had been. He shoved his arm into the hole, grabbed a support beam, and wrapped his free arm around Leilani's waist. With Geordi's help, Leilani swung Todd out of the main current. Finally, Todd got his feet under him, and Leilani pulled him to the group. The cadets on the outside linked arms to keep everyone together. The water pushed the door farther open. At first, the bigger opening didn't make much difference. There was too much water beyond it. It smashed through the opening and thundered down the corridor. Spray splattered Geordi's back, soaking him to the skin. The water level climbed quickly up his legs. It rose from his ankles to his knees to his waist within seconds. Geordi shivered, wondering if he'd guessed wrong. What if it was the connecting tunnel that had the hole in it? Could they get into the next part of the station after this sector flooded? The racing tide slowed to a strong river, and, finally, to a lazy current. The water remained only waist deep, for which Geordi was grateful. This far down in the ocean, the temperature was barely above freezing. His feet and legs were growing numb from not moving. Leilani was shivering uncontrollably, and the other cadets looked equally miserable. When he thought he could keep his balance, Geordi started toward the door. To be safe, he held on to the opening where the control panel had been. Cautiously, he looked through the door. The tube was intact, but the other door was half open. Something had jammed it, keeping it from closing all the way. The emergency light behind him was weak and flickering. It cast a pale yellow rectangle onto the flowing water. Geordi looked below the water's surface, swallowing hard, when he saw what held the door open. One of the scientists had tried to get through the door as it closed. He hadn't made it. To make matters worse, the door had caught his uniform. Between the door and the snagged uniform, the man had drowned before he could free himself. Geordi released his grip on the panel and moved forward. Bracing his foot against the other door frame, he pulled against the door. To his surprise, it slid easily. He stumbled, almost losing his balance. The scientist's uniform came free from the door's track. The body floated loose and drifted past Geordi. Behind it, carried along by the current, was more debris. Waterlogged clothing, unidentifiable personal objects, and 2 more bodies washed through the doors. Geordi flattened himself between the doors to let the junk go through. The water was flowing at a fair pace. It wasn't so fast that they couldn't move against it, but they would have to be careful. He looked up the corridor. Everything was dark and blurry, with the edges smeared together. Dismayed, Geordi realized there was barely enough light for his visor to detect. To make matters worse, the cold water was leaching the heat from the walls, the debris, and the bodies. Soon everything would be the same temperature, and he wouldn't be able to see heat differences either. Then the significance of the current hit him. Water was still getting into the station. With this door open, it could now fill both sections. Considering the pressure at this depth, the leak had to be small. Otherwise, the water would have refilled this section as fast as it poured through the door. "Come on, everyone," he said. "Let's get out of here before the water gets any deeper." "And before we freeze to death," Leilani's teeth chattered as she was shivering uncontrollably. "Link arms to keep together." The cadets moved out of their huddle. The cold had revived Ven a little, and he watched his surroundings with greater awareness. He let the clones lead him, but he held onto their arms with enough strength to show them he knew what was happening. In the waist-deep, icy water, they moved slowly. The current swept odd bits of clothing and assorted junk past them. It was a bad sign, Geordi thought. They were most of the way to the next pressure door, and they're still moving up current. The sound hit them first. It was like the roar of a huge waterfall. Geordi thought it sounded as if millions of steel balls were being slammed into the water every second. With each step, the noise grew louder. They came around the bend of the station, where they should have seen the next set of pressure doors. A curtain of water stretched 2/3 of the way across the corridor. "Oh," he said. He could barely hear his own voice. A seam between the hull plates had split. The water blasted through under high pressure. The entire width of the corridor seethed with foam. White froth splashed as high as the ceiling. Only the tremendous strength of the station's hull kept the roof from collapsing. "What do we do now?" Lissa stared at the wall of water. "We can't go through there, can we?" "We've got to go back." Todd straightened to his full height, trying to look like he was in command. Still shivering, Leilani shook her head. "The shuttle is docked to the next section. With that much water coming through here, we don't have time to backtrack." Geordi studied the wall of water, wishing he had a little more light. Even with his visor compensating for the low light levels, he was having trouble seeing details, and details were what he needed now. He tried to remember what he had seen when they arrived. The leak was about 10 feet from the door, he thought. That meant there was room for them to get to the door. No one could stand under the force of that water long enough to operate the door controls. Just a little more light, he thought. That's all I need. He wanted to double-check his memory. Unfortunately, the only light source was too weak and too distant to do him much good. Frustrated, Geordi stared at the shimmering wall of water. Did he have the right to risk his classmates' lives on an uncertain memory? How much time did they have before the rising water paralyzed them? What should he do? It was the first life-or-death decision he had ever made, and if he didn't act soon, cold water would decide for him. Geordi looked at his fellow cadets, but no one offered him any answers. It came back to the same question. How well did he remember what he had seen earlier? Before Geordi could decide, the floor began shaking. His first thought was that he was imagining things, that the cold had frozen his brain. However, waves rippled the water in rhythm with the shaking. Geordi didn't think he could have invented that. He splashed to the head of the line. There's room on the other side, he had to shout to be heard. Stay by the wall and don't let go of each other. Desperately hoping he was right, Geordi started forward. Much to his surprise, everyone followed. The water felt heavy, viscous, resisting his movements. The noise became deafening. Before we get past this, he thought, my ears will be as numb as my feet. In a way, he was glad he couldn't hear anything but the pounding water. Debating second thoughts wouldn't get them to safety. All I can say is, I better be right. Near the leak, the spray drenched them. Icy mist soaked Geordi's uniform and plastered it to his skin. Streams of water ran down his face. His legs were numb and his teeth chattered. Leilani nodded her head as though she was falling asleep. That wasn't a good sign. Her brain was shutting down from the cold. As they approached the wall of water, the current broke into violent eddies and whirlpools. The cross currents tugged and pushed at him from all directions. It was almost impossible to keep his balance. Geordi pushed forward. They didn't have any choice. He was 2 steps past the leak when his foot slipped. His legs were too cold for him to catch himself, and Geordi splashed into the freezing water. In a panic, he struck out for the end wall. His arms still worked, but he couldn't feel his legs. The current pushed him toward the door. His outstretched hands touched the wall. Shivering violently, Geordi dragged himself upright. By the time he was standing, the others had joined him. Yoshi tried to say something, but the noise from the pounding water was too loud for Geordi to make out the words. He looked around, congratulating himself that there was more room than he remembered. He waded toward the door. To his surprise, it was open. He looked through the opening and shuddered. Water shot through 6 pinhole leaks in the roof with enough force to cut metal. Something bumped into his legs. Geordi looked down, spotting the cover for the door's control panel. How far is it to the Aqua Shuttle? Geordi murmured. He tried to remember, but he felt so exhausted. It'd be so good to take a nap. A nice, long nap. When he woke up, he would be in his bunk at the academy, warm and dry. No! Panic shot through him. His body was dangerously chilled and his brain was shutting down. He shook his head to clear it. We must get to shuttle quickly, Yoshi said. The cold made it difficult for Geordi to see. With the emergency lights out, he was using residual heat. However, his visor couldn't separate things that were the same temperature. The images were dim and fuzzy and becoming dimmer all the time. We could use flashlight now, Yoshi said, echoing Geordi's thoughts. He wished they had brought one of the shuttle's high-powered waterproof flashlights with them. It is illogical to wish for that which we do not have, Tavarian said. Well, here goes. Geordi started forward, picking a snake-like path around the water jets. That added to the time it took to get to the shuttle, but they didn't have much choice. They were all very tired and thoroughly chilled. An accident right now, any accident, would be extremely dangerous. Finally, Geordi saw the tunnel leading to the docking port. They had almost made it. A ragged cheer went up from the others when he pointed to the door. Geordi picked up the speed a little, although it was impossible to hurry in the cold water. Still, just a few meters away lay warmth and safety and, if they were lucky, dry clothes. The floor began to shake. Geordi was too tired and too cold to be sure, but he thought this earthquake was a lot stronger than any of the previous ones. The water jets widened, and the thunder of the water grew louder. Over the pounding, roaring water, the station's structure creaked and groaned. Something ripped in the wall nearest him. Jump! Yoshi yelled. Geordi threw himself across the hall. Broken plastic and chunks of paneling sprayed the area where he'd been standing. In slow motion, the walls separating the corridor from a storage room disintegrated. Beams, panels, and chunks of conduit rained into the water. Shaking from the cold, Geordi pulled himself to his feet. One by one, the other cadets surfaced. Everyone seemed a little dazed. Todd had a long gash on his shoulder. It was bleeding freely, and Geordi felt dizzy from seeing so much blood. He was glad Lissa volunteered to help Todd. Leilani floated to the surface and hung there, motionless. Geordi wondered if she had hit her head, but he couldn't find any damage. Finally, he decided she had surrendered to the cold. If they couldn't revive her soon, she would die. He tried to lift her from the water, but her limp body was too heavy for him. Tavarian stumbled to his side, her movement stiff from being too long in the frigid water. The two of them dragged Leilani upright. Tavarian checked the seals on her rebreather mask. They were secure, but the gauges on the waist unit had all changed to amber. "These units are rated for 6 hours," Tavarian said. "It is not possible for the batteries to be running low already." Geordi checked the model numbers on the girls' rebreathers and glanced at his own unit. His battery light showed a warning amber color. Tavarian's did too. "They're shallow water units. They don't work well in cold water. We've got maybe 15 minutes of power left," he said. Amory grabbed his arm and pointed toward the fallen wall. "My sister!" Geordi counted heads. Emerald and Ben were not there. He looked where Amory was pointing. Beneath the collapsed wall were two blurred patches of warmth. The missing cadets were trapped under the wreckage. Chapter 10. "I see them," Geordi said. "That chunk of wall landed on them." "Are you certain that they are under there?" Tavarian asked. Geordi tapped his visor. "I see the heat from their bodies." "Are they hurt?" Amory asked. "I can't tell. We'll have to get them out first." Geordi looked to see who could help. Todd and Leilani were in no shape to do anything, and Lissa was still binding Todd's wound. That left Yoshi, Tavarian, and Amory to help him. He looked at Amory. "If we lift the wall, can you pull them out?" "Yes." Her tone said she would do anything to rescue Emerald. They waded to the collapsed wall. "Mass of wall does not look too large," Yoshi said. "However, its surface area will create a considerable amount of water resistance." Tavarian tilted her head to one side as if calculating the exact numbers. Geordi nodded. "Something that big will be awfully awkward to handle in the water. Also, there's all that heavy junk on top of it." They started to work. Geordi and Tavarian moved the heaviest beams while Yoshi and Amory cleared away the other debris. It took almost 5 minutes. Geordi tried not to think how long the batteries in their rebreathers would last. Leilani and Alven and Emerald were alive because they were wearing their masks. As tired and as cold as everyone was, any fall could be fatal without them. Geordi stared at the panel, trying to decide where exactly Emerald and Ben were. The eddies in the cold water and the thick insulation on the panel made it difficult for him to tell. Even when he used the visor at its maximum sensitivity, all he saw were vague smears of warmth. "Can you specify where they are trapped?" Tavarian asked. Geordi stepped to the side, trying to see things from a different angle. They had been standing near the wall when the earthquake hit. Most of the cadets had made flat, shallow dives that carried them across the corridor. From what he could see, Emerald and Ben had not moved. "They're here," he said, sketching the location with his hands. "Let's try to get them out from this side." Tavarian and Yoshi nodded. They moved beside him and squatted, working their fingers under the panel's edge. Amory crouched at his side, waiting. 1, 2, 3, Geordi counted. They heaved upward. It was like dragging a large plate through molasses. Geordi gritted his teeth and pulled harder. The muscles in his thighs protested. Slowly, the panel lifted. 10 centimeters, 20, 30. It was much harder work than he had thought it would be. Finally, Amory squeezed into the opening. She wiggled forward on her stomach. Ben was closest. Amory grabbed his arm and crawled backwards, dragging him after her. Ben was unconscious. When Amory released him, he floated to the surface, limp as a rag. Even without going to him, Geordi saw the amber warning lights on his rebreather. His batteries were almost exhausted, too. "We'd better hurry," he told the others. He seemed short of breath. Was it his imagination, or was he running out of air? Yoshi squatted down, putting his shoulder under the edge of the panel. Seeing how much more leverage that gave him, Geordi copied him. Tavarian shifted position, too. "Now!" Yoshi said. All three straightened their legs. Geordi felt his boots slipping, but he kept pushing. The panel moved another 15 centimeters upward. Amory crawled between them. The extra distance was enough to free Emerald, and Amory pulled her clone sister free. Emerald was shaken, but with Amory's help, she climbed to her feet. Once the clones were clear, Geordi braced his hands against the panel's bottom edge and stepped back. Tverian and Yoshi copied him, holding the panel at arm's length. They looked at each other, and Geordi nodded. "On the count of 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. They released the panel. It settled into the water, sending out a wave that almost pushed Geordi off his feet. Not that it would take much, he thought. He was just about done in. "Let's go," he said. He and Yoshi each took one of Ven's arms, dragging the unconscious Andorian through the water. After a worried glance at her sister, Amray went to help Tverian with Leilani. Amral followed Amray closely, her movement slow and uncertain. Geordi wondered if she'd been hurt by the collapsing wall, but he didn't see any obvious injury. Lissa put her arm around Todd's waist and led him forward. He seemed out of touch with his surroundings. Geordi figured he was in shock from his wound, but they couldn't do anything until they reached a shuttle. The 10 meters to the connecting corridor were the longest of Geordi's life. No one had much to say. They were all too tired and cold to spend their energy on anything but dragging themselves to safety. He was dizzy with relief when they reached the pressure door. With all the practice he'd been getting, it took him only a minute to disable the door's controls. The door slid open, revealing the dry stretch of corridor that led to their shuttle. The water poured through the opening. This time, rather than waiting for the current to slow, the cadets let the water push them through. Geordi grabbed onto the door, swung himself through the current, and ducked behind the door. The others tumbled through after him. Fumbling for the latch with his cold, stiffened fingers, Geordi popped the cover off the door's manual controls. They had to close it before the water flooded the corridor. He threw his weight against the lever. The water was a living force, clawing and smashing its way through the opening. Slowly, the door started to choke off the flood of water. Yoshi stumbled over to Geordi and added his weight to the effort. Together, they forced the door shut. Geordi slumped against the wall, leaning on the lever and panting for breath. Yoshi flashed him a tired, happy grin. They had gotten the door closed in time. There were only a few centimeters of water on the corridor floor. After he got his breath, Geordi started to get up. When he took his weight off the lever, it moved upward. The door slid back, letting in a stream of water. Yoshi looked from the door to the lever, frowning. The corridor walls were bare, with no tool lockers or equipment racks. With a shrug, Yoshi stumbled over to Ven. Removing one of the Andorian's boots, he brought it back and jammed it behind the lever. Slowly, Geordi released his grip. The lever squeaked against the boot, compressing the material. For a moment, he was afraid it wouldn't work. The lever squeezed the boot until it cut against the hard material of the sole. Geordi heaved a sigh of relief. The door would stay closed. They could walk through the nice, dry corridor to their shuttle. The 14 meters from the door to the shuttle felt more like 4. Geordi was so relieved to see their ship that the distance evaporated, even though he was helping Yoshi carry Ven. They reached the shuttle, opened its door, and stumbled in. Geordi eased Ven to the floor and headed forward, pulling off his rebreather. Through the front viewport, the water was black. When the power was up and running, he'd turn on the searchlights and take a look at the station. Sliding into the pilot's seat, he closed the shuttle's door and set the heater to maximum. He didn't know how hot it would get, but at the moment, high noon at midsummer on Vulcan's Forge sounded just about right. As the heat began to flow into the shuttle, he leaned back in the chair and surrendered to his exhaustion. When his brain thawed out, he decided what to do next. He was starting to feel pleasantly warm, despite his wet clothes, when someone put a hand on his shoulder. "We found some towels in back." Lissa handed him one. "Unfortunately, there aren't any spare clothes, but Tverian thinks she can make some hot soup from the stuff in the ration packs." "Thanks." Geordi straightened, suddenly feeling a whole lot better. Drying off and getting something to eat were exactly what he needed. He went to work with the towel, squeezing the water from his uniform. It was amazing how much better he felt. With the heat set on high, it wouldn't take long for his uniform to finish drying. The clones searched through the storage lockers and located the other supplies. Geordi took 2 of the candy bars they offered and nibbled on them while he checked out the shuttle systems. Behind him, the others were toweling off too. Lissa had appointed herself head nurse and was putting a field dressing on Todd's shoulder. Leilani and Ven, both barely conscious, were wrapped in blankets from one of the storage lockers. This whole crew needs to stay in sickbay, Geordi thought. He powered up the shuttle systems, preparing for departure. If he hadn't been afraid that the earthquakes had damaged his ship, he would have skipped all the routine checks. The computer was probably still keeping score on their piloting, but he didn't care. Right now, a fast escape was a higher priority than a good grade, so he raced through the systems check. "Strap down!" he called over his shoulder, satisfied that they were all ready to leave. "All set," came the answer from half a dozen overlapping voices. Geordi crossed his fingers and disengaged the grapples. He waited for the reassuring chunk of the clamps falling away from the airlock, but there was only silence. Geordi repeated the command, but still nothing happened. He stared at his status board, wondering what to do. The sensors said the clamps had been released. The other possibility wasn't something he wanted to consider. Cautiously, he engaged the starboard thrusters. The shuttle didn't move. He applied more power, but they remained where they were. The shuttle was still attached to the station. Geordi powered down the thrusters. They would have to manually release the grapples from outside the ship. Before he could unfasten his safety harness, the shuttle began shaking. "Not another earthquake," he thought. The shuttle jerked back and forth like a short, stubby tail attached to the body of the station. The readings of the shuttle's depth gauge were changing too, showing deeper and deeper water around them. Neptune's locker was headed for the ocean depths, still anchored to the rocks where it had been built.